Santos. I'm giving the talk tonight. A little unusual circumstances. I was just notified yesterday night that I was exposed to COVID. This morning, my wife tested positive. I tested negative, but I'm feeling it, so I think I'm positive too. So it's just as well that I'm not there. Thank you to the Newburyport Public Library for being so quick on their toes and saying, well, we can still do this and we can still do it with Zoom. And I said, wow, that's kind of usually Zoom, everybody's on, or it's usually not the presenter it's on and people are in the room, but I think it's going to work. So let's give it a try. And we'll go through this wonderful research and presentation that I've been putting together for the past year. We've got about 12, 13 people online as well. Welcome to all the online people. Keep yourselves on mute and video off as you've done. Everybody knows how to use this thing now, so that's great. And we're going to talk about Bacchanalia, murder, and the Newburyport waterfront. Of course, that's the title I use to get everyone in the room. But what we're really going to talk about is the life of Great Watt. And Great Watt, as it turns out, a lot of people in Newburyport know a little bit about Great Watt, but nobody has all the facts. And the facts are there. And for the past year, I've been kind of exploring and trying to dig it up and put it all together. And I have to tell you the truth, thanks to Skip and Marge Moats, without them, this presentation would not be happening. They actually have been doing a lot of research on Great Watt. And I kind of said, can I use some of that material? And I'll try to fill in the blanks and put the rest of it all together. And they said, sure, go ahead. Skip and Marge may even be in the room. I don't see them online. So I'm sure there might be questions that I won't be able to answer that they will. But again, thanks to them for allowing me to use some of their material and getting me thinking about Great Watt. You may have thought about Great Watt too, especially if you've noticed this sign in a little corner next to the firehouse. Very interesting. It's kind of hidden. It's next to the fire department connections. Most people wouldn't even give it a glance. Hidden in a corner in Newburyport, and it really is a sign that talks about Great Watt and Great Watt's Cellar. For those of you that don't know, Watt's Cellar is something that showed up in most of the colonial deeds for Newburyport, usually as a reference point, like this piece of land is just to the left of Watt's Cellar, or this piece of land is just to the right of Watt's Cellar, or you need to take the road that goes to Watt's Cellar. But it was pretty clear that nobody knew who, or at least the current day knew who Watts was, and possibly even at the time of the deeds, it was just handed down. And there was obviously somebody here before the first settlers came up and landed on the Parker River in Newbury. So this guy Watts is kind of a mysterious fellow. There's very few firsthand accounts, and the evidence about Great Watt and Watt's Cellar is circumstantial at best. And the story I'm going to tell you is really a kind of a colonial point of view, not necessarily the native people's point of view. And some of it is speculation. So I have to put this disclaimer in place. This whole story is completely true, except for the parts that are totally made up. And I hope I didn't make too much up. I think I've got a lot of the facts and the data behind this, but it can still be challenged. And most historians, if there were professional or even amateur historians in the room, they might sit there and say, oh, come on, Jack, you're stretching it a little bit here. And maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but it makes for a great story. So let's talk about Great Watt for a second. And I was a little reluctant to actually do a presentation about Great Watt, as we found out, or we think, or we speculate, is really short for a fellow named Walter Bagnall. And back in those days, in colonial times, Walter would get shortened, like it does today, to Walt and even to Watt. And we're pretty sure, I'd say with some degree of certainty, 90% certainty, that Walter Bagnall was Great Watt. We don't want to celebrate him. He was, by all accounts, not a nice man. He was first described as an indentured servant that arrived in the New World in 1623. That's 3 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. And John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, said this of Great Watt, quote, "This Bagnall was sometimes servant to one in the bay, and these 3 years has dwelt alone in the said island and had gotten about 400 the money of the time, just in goods. He was a wicked fellow and had much wronged the Indians." Yeah, that's pretty good. If John Winthrop, who had also much wronged the Native Americans, is calling this guy a wicked fellow and had much, then, well, that's something to be said. So I would put Watt in the category as the other evil personages on this page over history. Possibly not quite as broad as some of the mass murderers we see here, but he was not a very nice man. And we don't have pictures of him, of course. It was 1623. Photography wasn't invented, and there are no portraits of him, but he was pretty evil. So let's talk about Great Watt and where he came from. But before we do that, why did he come here in 1623? Why did he come from England across the ocean to New England? And we have one person to thank for that. That's Captain John Smith. Now, let's not forget, we in New England are very proud of Plymouth and the Pilgrims and then the Puritans. But really, the first English colony in the New World was in Virginia in 1607 at Jamestown. And Captain Smith was a resident of that colony. He's famous because of the little liaison he had with Pocahontas. But he's even more famous for this map. And this map put together by Captain John Smith, yes, it's a map, but it's also a lesson in marketing. Because John Smith put together this map in 1616, and it was less about trying to find where you are and more about getting people in England interested in coming to the New World. And he did that by creating a map of New England and putting place names on it at a time when there were no English people living here. It was only Native Americans, and there were no place names. But he happened to name the place names things like the names of rich people in England in the interest of getting them over here and investing in the New World, or significant landmarks like Cape Anna and Cape Elizabeth after royalty in England. So he was a smart cookie, and it worked. It made a lot of people think about coming to the New World and getting on ships from London and Portsmouth and other places and over to the New World. So hats off to John Smith and his marketing. His marketing led to the Pilgrims deciding to come to the New World and land in Plymouth in 1620. It was, at the time, land that was inhabited by the Patuxet Indians. And of course, the Pilgrims just kind of moved in and took over and established a community such as this one at Plymouth and Patuxet today. You may be looking at this picture and say, oh, that's not an actual picture of the way it looked like before. There's some modern people in there. Yes, there are, my grandchildren and my wife, who they're talking to Miles Standish. Besides their clothing, the modern clothing of the three people in the foreground, what else is wrong with this picture? Well, Miles Standish was never that tall. He's way too tall. Miles Standish the protector of the colony, a very militaristic fellow who plays prominently in this story about Walter Bagnall or Great Wat, was a very short fellow, probably about the height of the young woman in blue there. So it's so Plymouth Pawtuxet didn't quite get it right on the height, but yeah, it's probably pretty close to the kind of clothes that he would be wearing at the time. So if we go back to the map that Captain John Smith had put together, you can see he's described what was then called Cape James, or what we now know today as Cape Cod. Again, a tip of the hat to King James, and then all these other places that he just made up names for. South of Boston was London. Salem, he got in approximately the right place. You would think people would come to the New World, and they'd look at this map and they say, oh, okay, we will call it Salem. And that's exactly what we did. So there were colonies that came on board 1620, Plymouth, of course. And then Salem, 1626, the first people in Western European white settlers settled there, and it was established in 1629. And then, of course, there was Boston, same 1625, some of the first English inhabitants, and then formally established in 1630. What we didn't learn in school, and I was amazed as everyone, is that there was a fourth colony that was established, and that colony is the colony that the Puritans and the Pilgrims would have liked us to forget, Marymount. It was first occupied in 1624 and formally established in 1625. What I find about this map that's very interesting is how evenly spaced the colonies were. It must have been planned, and how Marymount fit in quite nicely between Boston and Plymouth. But by all rights, it was the second colony that was established here in the New World, and it's the colony that, if you were like me, you didn't even know existed. So Marymount was actually in the Quincy area. It was first visited in 1621 by Miles Standish and the native guide Squanto. So they kind of landed in Plymouth. They went up north a little bit to scout out other sites. They found that area just south of Boston in the Quincy area. 4 years later, Captain Wollaston, who was up in Maine, established a post in that spot. And a few months after Wollaston was there, he turned it over to Thomas Morton. And in fact, the place names are still named after them. There's Wollaston, the neighborhood in Quincy, and then there's Marymount Park, because Thomas Morton renamed it to Marymount. Thomas Morton took over leadership, and he had a history of conflict with the Plymouth settlement because he was a free thinker. And he antagonized the settlement. He maligned the colony in the settlement, Plymouth, maligned the Marymount colony, accused it of debauchery with Indian women and drunkenness. Bagnall was a member of Marymount. He was one of the dozens of people that established that colony. He was here as a fisherman, as a hunter, as a coast trader, and would send furs and fish back to England and make money that way. And most of his compatriots that did the same ended up living in Marymount, here in what is now Quincy, Massachusetts. That when Morton renamed it to Marymount, he was definitely thinking of a pun. He first thought of it as Mar-e-Mount, like Mar-e-Lago, sea and land. But then, of course, there's Marymount, the happy hill. And then there's a Marymount that could have a much more sexual reference, which I am sure did not escape Morton and his cohorts' view in terms of what that area was like. And it's exactly why the Pilgrims and later the Puritans didn't like this colony at all. In fact, Marymount was the site of maypole celebrations. Very different from what we know today. It's not that child's maypole game. It was a pagan debauchery. And well, think of it this way: Salem, Boston, uh, and Plymouth are a lot like the UU, Old South, the Congregational Church. Wow. Marymount was more like a grog or thirsty whale on a Friday or Saturday night. And yes, there was a big difference. Oh, you may be sitting there saying, Jack, okay, you're making this all up. Don't believe me. Believe Governor Bradford of Plymouth. And let me read his quote. Those who frequented the maypole led a dissolute life, powering out themselves into all profaneness. And Morton became the lord of misrule and maintained, as it were, a school of atheism. Oh my gosh. And after they had got some good into their hands and got much by trading with the Indians, they spent it as vainly in quaffing and drinking. They set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together, and worse practices. Well, consorts, that meaning still holds true. Dancing, frisking, yeah, I could use that term a few times. Quaffing blew my mind. What the heck is quaffing? To drink a beverage, especially an intoxicating one, copiously and with hearty enjoyment. So this was the Bacchanalia part of the story, Marymount, where our lead character, the Great Watt, lived. Now, Morton, for his credit, said this. He found the native people, especially the few members of the Massachusetts tribe who had survived the 1617 plague by early European traders, among the most admirable and moral people he had ever met. What a difference of opinion between those Marymount and the other three English settlements. You knew this wasn't going to last long. Well, I skipped ahead. You knew this was going to last long. John Endicott, who led the Salem group, John Winthrop, who led the Mass Bay and Boston group, and eventually kind of pushed Endicott out and took over. William Bradford, who was the governor of the Plymouth colony, they all had one thing in common, one common enemy, one agreement: Marymount was not to last. In their minds, were they establishing a new world that was a city on a hill or a bar on a corner? We know where it ended up, Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill. So in 1627, 7 years after Plymouth, and 8 years before the English landed on the Parker River and established Newbury, Morton was arrested by Standish for violating the code of conduct in a way harmful to the colony. Endicott, Winthrop, and Bradford agreed that Bradford should send Miles Standish down there, arrest Morton, and send him back to England. Morton went to England, probably in chains, came back the following year, back to the colony. They would have none of it. They shut it down finally for good in 1628. Miles Standish again. And by 1632, John Winthrop and the Mass Bay colony decided to take over that little border territory that was between his colony and the Plymouth colony. Now, all of this is well documented, and you can go to Thomas Morton, who had the final say. He wrote the New English Canaan, an abstract of New England, and described his experiences in Marymount and in the New World. He had also had some priceless words to say about Miles Standish, calling him Mr. Shrimp. Yeah, shrimp. There's a word that's kind of lasted for 400 years. It would still be an insult today. You're a shrimp, and that's exactly what he called Miles Standish. No wonder he could only have this printed in Amsterdam. They would have none of it printed in London or England. On the lighter side, 200 years later, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about Marymount. Over the years, Marymount has kind of come up into the public consciousness in about 1850. It did again, and Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Maypole of Marymount. Let me read an excerpt of that. Bright were the days of Marymount, when the Maypole was the banner staff of that gay colony. And Endicott, the severest Puritan of all, who laid the rock foundation of New England, lifted the wreath of roses from the ruin of the Maypole, threw it with his own gauntleted hand over the heads of the Lord and Lady of the May. It was a deed of prophecy. As the moral gloom of the world overpowers all systemic gaiety, even so was their home of wild mirth made desolate amid the sad forest. They returned to it no more. So we know where Nathaniel Hawthorne stood on this. He felt that the world needed a little bit more happiness and gaiety, and that this was a turning point in reducing that in the New World. So Marymount gets closed down, and it is documented that we know of 4 people that survived after its closure. And these are the only 4 out of all the people in Marymount that we know of, or at least that I was able to discover in my research. Thomas Morton, we already talked about. He went back to England, wrote the canon, and he was never to return. Edward Gibbons redeemed himself and became a leading citizen. He asked apology from Winthrop, and they actually he had a change of heart. He joined the Salem Church in 1628, and he was an associate of Morton. He was maybe even in another indentured servitude, as Walt Bagnall was. Apparently, Morton would bring many of his indentured servants to his new colony. And but Edward was accepted into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, died in Boston in 1654. His wife returned to Plymouth, England shortly thereafter, died in 1656. The 2 that we're most concerned with are Walt Bagnall and P. Somebody we only know as P. And the only reason we only know him as P, he was alluded to in some of the diaries, and they were damaged, and we're guessing that P referred to as John Peverly. John Peverly, as you may know, that name may sound familiar because it's associated with Ordinary Point in Portsmouth. He may have been related to the Peverly family that ended up in the Portsmouth area, Peverly Hill Road, a commonly traveled street even today. Well, but Walt Bagnall and John Peverly, if P was indeed Peverly, we believe that to be true, became a team. And they continued to trade along the coast, and they went to Maine. Why Maine? Well, let me tell you why Maine. Maine at that time was the Wild West of the New World. In 1622, this fellow, Fernando Gorges, had received a grant, a land patent for Maine, for the province of Maine. And at that time, it was documented as from the Merrimack River to the Kennebec River. That was the province of Maine. Fernando Gorges was the lord that ruled over the province of Maine. Again, going back to John Smith's map, he was on there, and yeah, he bought it hook, line, and sinker and said, okay, yeah, if I'm good enough to have a name on there, I suppose I should own some land. But he never came to the province of Maine, and he just let it run amok. It was pretty much a Wild West, lawless area of the country at that point, of the New World. He never visited. He did not closely manage his holdings. It was a free-for-all, a perfect place for 2 scoundrels like Walt Bagnall and John Peverly to end up. And that's exactly what they did. They left Marymount and they came to what was then Maine, and they traveled along this path, going around Cape Ann. And then eventually you would think, and this is where some speculation comes in, Newburyport is almost exactly halfway between where they lived in Marymount and where both John Peverly and Walt Bagnall ended up living on Richmond Island in Maine. Why would they pick Newburyport? Well, first of all, the fact that it would be halfway, and each of these legs of the trip would be 1 to 2 days by sea to get there. It's a convenient place to stop. It's a good place to rest. But it was also a major, at that time, truck stop. Yes, we had a truck stop here in Newburyport in 1628. Not quite this kind of truck stop. If you're a coast trader, you would trade with the Native Americans, and with the places that you would trade would be called a trucking station. And that trucking station at that time was Deer Island. A photograph here taken from the Chain Bridge, and a well-known, well-documented Deer Island, and the land just on the other side, that big flat expanse of green, was a major American, a Native American meeting point where there would be a lot of trading taking place. So it was a trucking station, just the kind of place Walt Bagnall would go to trade with the natives. And we know he traded with the natives. We know he made money by sending those furs and fish back to England. So why wouldn't you stop here? Why wouldn't you set up a temporary home and keep your goods there in your cellar? It's interesting, that word truck, because it still kind of holds true today. We have trucks. It's all about trading. I have no truck with you. That's an old saying that says, I want nothing to do with you. I don't want to trade with you. Or the Grateful Dead, keep on trucking. Yes, the term lives. So there's a pretty good reason why Walt Bagnall would end up here in Newburyport as a coast trader, and probably set up shop here in downtown Newburyport, near the firehouse, near where that sign is today. The travels of Great Wat would take him to Newburyport, and then for another 1 to 2 day trip along the coast to Richmond Island. You may not have heard of Richmond Island. It's up near Scarborough. It's a fascinating island. It's just south of Cape Elizabeth. You could actually walk to it if they allowed you to. It's not allowed. There is a breakwater from the mainland, and it confirms our story about Great Wat, because on Richmond Island we have Watts Point, and there's Watts Ledge, and just outside of this picture of the island, there's Watts Rock. So a lot was named after Walt Bagnall, or Great Wat, or Great Walt. Up on Richmond Island, is pretty well documented that he had a home on Richmond Island with John Peverly in about 1628, and that he traded with the Sagamore Indians, Sagamore Skinny-Garusset, who was the local Sagamore in the area, and would trade for dried beaver hides and barter with them. That was his island base. So we're pretty sure Bagnall lived on Richmond Island, would come to Newburyport, trade with the Native Americans here in Newburyport, and have a place in Newburyport where he would also stay and use as kind of a base. I was so interested. I said, oh gosh, Richmond Island, I got to see Richmond Island. So I got my crew together and said, let's paddle out to Richmond Island and see what's going on with the Great Wat, and if we can find anything out there. The island is still there. That's that land out in the here in the distance, about a half mile to mile offshore. And my crew, which consisted of my wife Astrid Lawrenson and Sherry Bonder, got in our kayaks and paddled out to Richmond Island. So it was just a lot of fun to do. That's the pictures from Richmond Island. If you go out there today, it's actually, there are trails. It's open to the public, and there are trails out there. It's a private island, privately owned, but they graciously keep it open to the public. And you can even camp there if you get camp reservations ahead of time. There's of course, you got to bring your own water, bring your own wood, and all that sort of stuff. But there are some campsites on Richmond Island, and that's one of them here in the upper left-hand corner. If we look at this wider view, and in the distance, you can see the house that is on one of two houses on Richmond Island. And yes, you can be sure that that location was probably the location for Great Watt's house, because it's actually located right near a dock and a sandy shore, the perfect place to land and here in this area up here to land and establish a house. The house there now is much more recent, but I'm pretty sure that that particular location would be Great Watt's location on the island. And here's a broader view of Richmond Island. If I can get to it, let's see. There we go. More of a large view of the island, and somebody way off in the distance, you can see what the fields are mowed. And those fields are interesting because it's clear these were farmer fields at one time. In fact, on Richmond Island in 1850, a farmer was plowing his fields and hit a clay pot. He got out of his off the horse and looked at the clay pot, and sure enough, it was filled with gold coins and a ring. This is now at the Massachusetts Historical Society, both the remnants of the pot and the coins and ring. The cash included this 20-shilling coin, which bears on the image of King Charles I, Charles, by the grace of God, King of England. The ring is marked GV in reverse. It was used. It was an inscription. It was a signet ring used for as a seal. And all of this has been traced to Bagnall and Walt Bagnall. It's all from that area. So we're pretty sure that, and we know that Walt Bagnall would hoard money and bury it. So pretty sure that this pot was Walt Bagnall's. He put some money in it, and he left it there in the field, and it was discovered in 1855 by a farmer plowing the field. Not surprising, because Watt had an untimely end. Skiddery Gusset, the Sagamore, and two others killed Watt on Richmond Island and killed P, and possibly his family. P would go back to England every year. That's documented, and he would trade. He would bring the furs to England, and he was the leg of the whole transaction that brought back money. So Sagamore Skiddery Gusset was wronged in one of their deals, and he killed Great Watt and P. It was interesting. Shortly after his death, Walter Bagnall had asked for the deed to that island, and Fernando Gorges had granted it to him, not knowing that he was dead at the time. Came over by ship and arrived here after about a month or two after he died. Winthrop, remember John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, he had no interest in pursuing the killers. This was very unusual, because at that time, if a Native American, if an indigenous person killed a white colonist, you can bet there would be repercussions, and we would demand the same, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But when it came to John Winthrop, that Watt, he was an evil fellow. He basically said, good riddance. I have no interest in doing anything and following up on getting even for a Great Watt's death, even though all the locals pleaded for him to do something. 18 months later, the locals did something on their own. They landed on the island, and they lynched the only Native American that was there in retribution, that had absolutely nothing to do with the murder. Sagamore Skiddery Gusset went on to live a long life. Black Will, who surprisingly was a Native American that was pushed out of Lynn and then Salem and came up, thought he had gotten far enough away from the white colonists and landed and lived on Richmond Island after Watt. He was lynched wrongly and killed for the murder of Great Watt and Peverly. That's the murder of our story about Great Watt. And what's this all about, a cellar? We haven't really talked about what a cellar is. Of course, it could mean the same term that it means today. Cellar is a hole in the ground, maybe under a building. The only cellar that is still in existence that was well documented is that has become a historic site in Maine. It's on the Saco River, and this is a photo from around the 1890s of three young ladies in this Native American cellar on the Saco River. And you can see, surrounded by rock, easily enclosed, a great place to keep something cool, to store your fish or food. This cellar is still there on the Saco, and it's a great example of a cellar. It could be similar to what we might have had here in Newburyport. The picture on the left is Deer Island. Deer Island, as you all may know, has a lot of rock and a lot of places that could be made into a cellar for storage. And no doubt the Newburyport waterfront was somewhat rocky and may have looked like this before it was filled, or some of the rock was literally exploded to make it easier for ships and not be a hazard. Or it could be something along the lines of what is here on the right. These are actual fishing cabins on the east coast of Portugal, a much more rugged area than it was here. But you kind of get the idea that Great Watt might have had a small shack like that in downtown Newburyport, dug a hole to keep things cool, along the lines of a root cellar, and would store fish and dry them next to the shacks in Newburyport, and use the place to collect is what he had hunted or fished for trading, and eventually for selling to England. So either one of those examples could have been Great Watt Cellar in downtown Newburyport. So let me kind of recap. And this all happens in a 10-year period. It's only a 10-year period. The Pilgrims landed in 1620. Around 1620, even before to 1625, fishermen and hunters were coming over from Europe, and they would fish, they would hunt, they'd stay here for a season, they'd go back. They were not permanent until around 1625, when they started permanently staying at Marymount. And that became a place that was not established for religious reasons, but established mainly for capitalist reasons, to make money and to have fun, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I suppose maybe not the rock and roll, but certainly all the rest of it. But it's between 1628 and 1630, Great Watt was out trading with the Indians as a coast trader, stopped in Newburyport, established Watt Cellar, which was used as a marker for all the earlier deeds, killed in 1631 on Richmond Island, 4 years before the landing of the first settlers in Newburyport. This was a busy place at that time. So what I'm playing is a Marymount story in 1930, an opera by Howard Hanson, where he got enthralled by the story about Marymount and created an opera. It still exists. Look it up on YouTube. It really is a cool piece of music. But it's not the end. Is it really the end? No! Just a little bit more. We really want to know exactly where Great Watt Cellar was. And research by Elizabeth Harris, local Elizabeth Harris, and more recent research by Skip and Marge Moats says it isn't here next to the firehouse. Why is that sign even there? It's an afterthought. They had no idea where to put the sign. They put it next to the wall next to the firehouse. It's time to think about where that sign should be. And we've got some good data on this. First, we start with an archaeological study that was done at the start of redevelopment in 1977. The Port and Market, this is available online on the internet. It's a fascinating, detailed study of what was dug up. This is a map from it. And if you look at all the marked areas, T1, A6, A5, A1, A4, these were actual places that were dug up and artifacts pulled out. I think the artifacts are down at the Massachusetts Historical or Massachusetts Museum down in Boston. But the two places that were candidates for where Great Watts Cellar were both near the Middle Shipyard, where that sign is today, next to the firehouse, and over here where it's identified as a garden, but it was where a set of warehouses got built, and the building's still there today. I'm going to turn the map around so that State Street is on the upper side and Water Street and Merrimack Street to the right, only because we're going to reference this map out of that archaeological study to recent maps that Chris and that Skip and Marge have put together. But you get a pretty good idea of the warehouse point that Captain White, the first wharfs that were put in Newburyport, where all that was, and where Watts Cellar may be, and the speculation about where Watts Cellar may be. I think Skip and Marge think that's wrong, and I kind of agree with them. They think that, in fact, the trading posts and cellars and fish curing stations and seasonal dwellings were a little further back from the water. So rather than where the yellow stars are, they're more along the street that we now travel over daily. In fact, if we overlay a Google map, we'll say Great Watts Cellar somewhere between French Twist Salon, Plum Island Coffee Roasters, One Pig's Fly, and Sea Level Oyster Bar in the firehouse along the street. And if we overlay it one more time with the Google map and the map that the Mozes have put together, you'll get a pretty good idea of where it is most likely Watts Cellar was really established. So, and there's a lot of more on this map that's interesting. West Gutter with a little street that came down State Street, Watts' Spring, which is referred to in some of the deeds a little further away. The gutters were kind of narrow pieces of land that dug in between rocks. This great rock was exploded because it was a hazard to navigation. It's no longer there. So yeah, so Great Watts Cellar is probably, we all walk over it almost every day, right on Water Street. And that's why I'm proposing, as I'm sure Skip and Marge would propose, that sign next to the firehouse be moved. And we should put it there, more and closer, and probably right on the spot that Watts Cellar was. Not in honor of that evil man, Walt Bagnall, but in honor of the history of Newbury and Newburyport, and the first original settler that actually stayed in downtown Newburyport. And with that, it really is the end. So the room, now this is going to be unusual. This is kind of weird. We're not all used to doing this kind of in reverse Zoom. I'm going to take questions from anybody online. Folks should be able to unmute themselves if they want to ask a question or put something in chat, and I'll try to answer it. And maybe, if possible, if somebody's in the room here in the library, you might be able to unmute that laptop, and then people can walk up to the laptop and ask a question. But let's start with online folks. Is there anybody online who has a question? Oh, one other thing. You can also SMS me. I'll watch my text messaging at that phone number, or send me questions after to that email. Anybody online that wants to has a question?
I just put a question online.
Oh, is Great Watt related? Oh, great. Yeah, let me, well, hold on. Oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? Oh, I ended the presentation, but let's see. The question online is Great Watt related to Dr. Elmer Bagnall of the Merrimack School? As far as I know, and in all the research that I've done, there were no survivors of the family of either Great Watt or John Peverly. There is some indication that Peverly had his family at Richmond Island with him, and that they were killed by the Native Americans at that point. So if there is a relation, it's a distant relation, but not a direct relation to Walt Bagnall, and no relation to Bob Watts either. Any other question? You can put it in chat, or unmute your microphone and turn on your video, or send me a text, or there's lots of ways to do it. I should have left the text number up there, which I'll try to do right now. But the name of the opera. Oh, what's the name of the opera? That's a very good question. Marymount. It's the name of the opera is actually let's see this. Let's see if I can find it. The story, The Marymount Story by Howard Hanson, 1930. Is somebody brave enough? Oh, I can see everybody in the library. Hi, everybody. Is somebody brave enough to unmute and talk to the laptop? And I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. I was so looking forward to this all year. COVID. Well, yeah, I hear the microphone's on. I can hear the crowd. All right. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I don't see any questions. I don't see anything on chat. I don't see anything coming across in the on SMS. So one last chance for anybody in the room. You might have to go walk up to the laptop and talk to the laptop. As funny as that sounds.
It's me again. I have a question. I see from an article, a recent article in New York Times, that they have just exonerated the last witch victim in Salem, and a school class did this, a group of middle schoolers or something. Is there some way that we can get a school class involved in moving that sign?
I would love to see that happen. I think there's a lot of opportunity. That sign should be moved. That's a perfect spot in the triangle. And now that we have some research that shows that that's probably the exact spot where Great Watts Cellar was, why not?
The project with the Salem witch got the kids involved in understanding laws and political action and all of this other thing that sounds like some of that would be involved in the Great Watch sign removal project.
I agree. It would be great. I mean, where it is now, it's kind of a disgrace, but that's okay. And somebody in the chat box asked about the connection to the Wheelwrights that was mentioned in the promo blurb. I can't remember what exactly the promo blurb said, but most of my research is about the Wheelwright family here in Newburyport. And the only connection between Great Watt and the Wheelwrights is that the Wheelwrights actually were kicked. They also were not big fans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the governor of Massachusetts. And they got kicked out. John Wheelwright, the original Wheelwright here in the New World, was kicked out of Massachusetts, sent to Maine. So Maine pops up again. John Winthrop didn't like him at all. And he established the town of Wells, Maine, in Maine. But there's, as far as we can tell, there's really no connection between them and Great Watt, because they didn't get here until the 1670s or so. The Wheelwrights. Do you believe Miles Standish's arm holding a knife over Native Americans should be removed from the Massachusetts state flag? Wow, there's a hot topic. Everybody who's not familiar with the flag, there's a Native American. Gee, I wish I had one here. I do have a mass flag somewhere, but there's a Native American. Hold on. I just happened to be in my office. I wouldn't have this I have a Massachusetts state flag. There it is. Okay, so there's a Native American, and then over the Native American's head, above the blue field, is an arm with a sword, which most people take to mean, when that was established, that the dominance of the European white settlers over the natives. And it's a controversial topic. There's, of course, a lot of people that want to keep things the way they are, and then there's a lot of people that say, no, it's time to move on and maybe change that. I would put myself in the latter camp. It's time to rethink that a little bit. And do you know if they are related to the Wheelwrights who founded Exeter? No, one other question, Casper, more online. Yes, John Wheelwright. Actually, that is kind of an interesting story. John Wheelwright, who was kicked out of the Mass Bay Colony by John Winthrop, he first went to Exeter with his followers, established Exeter. John Winthrop extended the Mass Bay Colony to include Exeter. One of the reasons being because he wanted to get Wheelwright, and Wheelwright kept hightailing up north to Maine and established Wells. Eventually, all was forgiven. Wheelwright preached in just over the river, and he's buried across from this, in the cemetery near the Catholic Church at just across the river. If there are no other questions, I don't see anything texted, or nobody is online is brave enough to unmute their mics and turn on their video anymore. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I'm so glad you enjoyed the research. And we'll probably be doing this again because of my COVID-ness, probably sometime in September. Now, if somebody wants to put the contact info up, I will. Let me see if I can share my screen so you can see my email. Oh my gosh. Hold on. There we go. And I'll just share my screen so you can copy down the contact info and contact me anytime. Be glad to talk about this more, or if you have other questions, or if somebody's found out more. This is living history. There's always more to be found out about Walt Bagnall and Great Watt and Watt Cellar. Again, thanks. And have a great evening, everybody.